Welcome to Let's Talk Better Forestry, a space for conversations about forests, the people who work with them, and the policies that shape them. We're here to slow things down a bit, to go beyond the headlines, and hear from the people behind the work, in their own words. Honest, thoughtful, sometimes messy conversations, but always grounded in real experience.
Hello and welcome to the Let's Talk Better Forestry podcast. I'm Morag Paterson from Forest Policy Group, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Andrew Macqueen. So over to you, Andrew. Tell us who you are and how you got into forestry.
Thanks, Morag. Yes, I'm an independent forester based in the south of Scotland, and I got into forestry slightly on a whim, to be honest. I was sort of leaving high school, not really sure what to do, learning to drive at the time, and it was my driving instructor who suggested as a slightly restless, outdoorsy type that maybe I consider forestry. And he sold it to me as you might never be rich, but you might be happy, which appealed to me infinitely at the time. So I checked out a few courses and ended up going and studying at Aberdeen. I had a few familial connections in Aberdeen, so I was quite happy in the city there. And yeah, it was great. It was totally transformative doing that degree and learning about forestry, and it's been a vocation ever since. So a chance occurrence that turned into be a really good life choice.
Fantastic. That could be the trademark, couldn't it, for all the motto for the sort of future forestry training and all the courses that are
Yeah,
going on. Yeah, because it's such a
sure.
good way of thinking about it. Brilliant. So can you give us some examples of your day-to-day work? You know, what does an average day? I know there's probably no such thing as an average day in the forest. So, give us an idea of what your work actually involves.
Yeah, no, like you say, it's I think for lots of people in forestry, it's a very varied job in that it takes in so many different disciplines. I think for me, sort of maybe 50% of my work is direct forest management, so working with clients directly and doing everything from like planning and management type activities down to physical planting and pruning and that kind of work. So that's maybe the most varied side of it, working directly in the forest for the forest, as it were. But also, I still do quite a bit of contracting back to various management companies and different estates and things. Doing a range of survey type work. I guess soil survey is one of my big strings. But also just everything down to marking drainage and marking out sites and things. So the full spectrum, I guess. So yeah, there isn't really an average day, which is good. I much appreciate it.
Yeah, so a nice mix of practical hands-on work and then back in the
Yeah,
office planning and all the rest of it.
yeah, which I really appreciate because I think forest management has become a very office-based task these days. So it's nice to get back out, touch some grass, as they say, now and again.
Yeah, for sure. Just keeping you grounded in what's actually
Mm,
happening in
for
reality,
sure,
as opposed to
for
the kind
sure.
of theory of it all and the economics of it all. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's an awful lot of compliance and due diligence to be done these days that you can end up just shuffling paper, and the forest becomes a bit of a secondary activity to, all these important things that we need to do, but are feel a bit secondary to actually managing the forest and making the trees grow well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so, and you're quite well known in the industry, and that's, partly, I think, because, you do quite a few experimental approaches in the forest. Is that right? And would you like to tell us a little bit about some of them?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think a lot of the core experimenting stuff we're doing is nothing new really. It's maybe all stuff that's been done in the past, but we're maybe just revisiting some of these aesthetics. I suppose policy in some respects is moving towards, there's a quite a hunger for increased diversity, I suppose, in policy. So we're maybe just um, responding to some extent to that need. So yeah, maybe the most obvious one is species diversity. I suppose some of the projects I'm involved with are growing perhaps a wider range of species than you would expect in a standard commercial forest, perhaps. And that's partly a function of some of the ground conditions. The site conditions are quite favourable, so we are able to grow a wider range of species. But even that said, it's not always the case that just because we have flexible conditions, we increase diversity. But yeah, myself and a few of my woodland owners are interested in growing a wider range of commercial species, particularly some of the durable redwoods like your Douglas firs and cedars and things, and some of the hardwood species too. But I guess not just growing different species, but growing them in mixtures too. I think we're kind of fairly convinced that mixed forests have a big role to play in that dreadful buzzword of resilience that everyone is using. But yeah, I think we face lots of increasing threats, be it climate change or pests and diseases. So it feels we're not going to be able to necessarily manage these things in an interventionist way when we begin to need sort of natural help. So possibly mixed forests and combinations of species for particular outcomes to give us protection against certain threats is maybe going to be a big factor. So yeah, maybe species diversity is a big one. And yeah, I think just maybe more intimate management, which is maybe more akin to sort of the estate management you see out there, where the forester gets quite a lot of time on the ground, knows the ground quite intimately, and can make fairly sort of nuanced decisions about the forest management, which I guess for a lot of people, we are short on time and short on money, so it's difficult to like be in the forest as much as you might want to be. There's that short-term economic pressure. But as I say, I don't think any of it is new as such. I think it's revisiting of ideas that have been prevalent in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And am I right in thinking you do some experimental thinning techniques as well? I think I remember from one of the forest visits
Yeah,
with the RSM
yeah. I mean,
house.
it's again that's kind of like a rehash of what they called oceanic forestry, which was sort of in vogue briefly in the 80s, I think it was, where it was kind of like a rapid respacing. So the idea being that wind is a big sort of limiting factor for thinning operations. You're always going to increase the risk of wind damage if you thin, just at least immediately post thinning. So the idea was that you would intervene just before canopy closure and sort of decapitate half the trees. So rather than removing them at the base, you would basically pollard them, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
So they would grow on as a tortured candelabra while their neighbours grew tall above them. So it was like hastening self-thinning, I suppose. And it got slightly dismissed at the time because they were, I think, of the view that the trees that were retained would be quite heavily tapered because their neighbours are removed quite early, and they would be quite branchy as a result. But I've seen a number of stands harvested that were produced through that method, and they were pretty good at final harvest. So, but I guess we now, because we're growing improved Sitka, the way that it grows is very different in terms of its crown architecture and its branch habits. So there's a lot more light, I suppose, in these stands. So although it's been done before, I guess the question of does it function the same under improved Sitka is a question that has lingered for me. And I see that this notion of quote halo pollarding has also appeared in the Norbury Park book. There's that estate down south where they've done a lot of sort of very interesting pollarding of trees as a means to thin them out. So it's what was once oceanic is now seems to be reinvented as halo pollarding. So like everything in forestry, there's reinvention of the wheel constantly, but it's quite good fun.
Yeah, yeah. So you're saying, are those results that you've seen on your own, on the forest you're managing, or are they on other forests that you've?
There were previous forests that I'd
Yeah.
either had some involvement with in the past or colleagues had taken me there or something.
Yeah, so you've got a little waiting game now to see how it impacts the harvest there.
Yeah, but I think thinning is still certainly in the south of Scotland is something we haven't quite had a lot of good experience of for the most part, just because the sort of age profile of a lot of our
Hmm.
plantations, the time that they were up for first thin, prices small roundwood was awful basically. So the economic basis for thinning was really poor. So I don't think we know the parameters of some of our sites and what they can or can't handle very well. So in some respects, these sort of early thinnings are, I think thinning early is always going to be the best for stability, but there's a counterbalance with economics and product removal and things. So yeah, just trying to establish the parameters of some of these things, it takes a bit of time.
Yeah, yeah. Because I was going to ask both on the species diversity part that you mentioned earlier, and now you've mentioned it with thinning. I was talking to a forester yesterday, and he was saying, one of the issues with this whole drive towards diversification is the end markets for these trees. And the economic case is quite difficult when if there's no market locally or regionally for some of the trees, and then also the compliance can be a bit higher, ironically, if you go down a more diverse route. Does that ring true for you? And do you have any kind of ideas of how we could build these markets more regionally
Yeah,
if needed to?
no, there's definitely truth in that. Particularly in the region that I'm in, we have a great coverage of larger scale whitewood mills. So it's the best product we can grow economically at the moment is spruce without doubt. There's ready markets for it. We know how it grows. It's and it's a wonderful supply chain. And I have to say also that it's the benefit of that is hugely integral in delivering diversity too. I think because we need a strong economic basis to make changes. So yeah, for a lot of the scenarios I'm in, like without the income from spruce, we couldn't have the sufficient cash base to diversify effectively or to support deer management and all the rest of the things that come with it. But yeah, in terms of the difficulty of forecasting a future market for decisions you make today, I mean, there's no great way around it. It's one of these chicken and egg ones, but I derive some comfort, I guess, from the fact that there was once upon a time no market for Sitka spruce in this country. The timber market was dominated by oak and pine and larch, and there seemed to be first-hand accounts of people sort of throwing caps on the floor and spitting down to say that all these American whitewoods, they're never going to make a market because they're too light and not durable. But sure enough, if growers go out there and make enough scale, then the market will likely respond. And I think if wood availability is set to flatline or decline in the future, but the demand is sort of this graph that runs off the chart, then I feel if we have fibre of any quality, I'm not sold that it's going to be valueless. And we're not growing for today's market either, is the thing. Like, yes, today, if I had a parcel of, I don't know, Japanese red cedar, it might not be particularly easy to sell any of it at scale, other than to the small and medium scale people, possibly in different regions. But yeah, I feel the drive for diversity in policy and the support that people like Scottish Forestry are putting into smaller scale sawmilling and more diverse setups that can take different assortments of timber. I mean, forestry is a game of hope. Anyway, I think you're to be forecasting that far ahead is kind of outlandishly hopeful anyway. So I don't feel like it's that difficult to put your place in that or put yourself in that position to just think, well, as long as we do our job right and make something quality, then yeah, I think somebody's going to have a need for it. I'm quite convinced.
Yeah, yeah. And do you think enough kind of work or there's enough spaces where people can step back and do that strategic thinking for the future? As
Yeah,
opposed to just saying this is what we've got and we have to work from this, space
yeah,
to look and say what really might we need and
yeah. I think it's really difficult, and it's certainly difficult for foresters on the ground to do that because you are doing your best in a short period of time to deliver for the forest, deliver for its owners. So it's hard sometimes not to be slightly blinkered just by working through the order of the day. Um, and then policy, I suppose, is in theory there to steer the boat at a higher level. But yeah, policy then sometimes drifts too far from the coal face, as it were. So it's hard to get that sweet spot between the two. Um, but yeah, I think the whole process of forest planning, I suppose, it's like we are sort of having to glimpse into the future in that respect. Like it's compulsory to look forward. Um, so yeah, I don't have a great answer for that because if you were to judge everything on today's economic conditions, we wouldn't change anything, I suppose. But then the future will inevitably change. Like there's no way in which the future is going to be the same as it is now. Um, so yeah, is there a space for people to step back? Maybe not as good as it ought to be. Maybe there's not as much room as there should be for that.
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, there's no. I don't think there is an answer to
No, of
the big
course.
question, is there? Because as you say, it's uncertainty, and uncertainty is something we will always have and will always live with.
Yeah.
So, but
But what
yeah,
I would say as well is that for foresters to make different or um, unorthodox choices, it does obviously require the cooperation and approval of the forest owner that they're working on behalf of. And sometimes that is a challenging place where it breeds in me particularly a level of conservatism that if I'm spending somebody else's money on forest operations and wanting their what would the word be? Wanting to do the best by them, it's always easier to incline towards what we have now and what we know and understand because I feel that will be the best chance of succeeding, at least in the short term. So I can have all my own personal feelings and views about what should be done or what I think will work, but it requires the forest owner to agree and not just agree, but buy into that, I think, at a higher level. So that's not always possible. But
mm,
thankfully, I've managed to gravitate towards some people that are quite into similar ideas to myself, so it makes a big difference.
yeah, yeah. It makes me wonder, because I was going to ask you about, what is working very well with your experiments and what you're still figuring out. But is there a mechanism whereby you're able to feed your results of your experiments on a kind of year by year basis, or whatever would be the sensible, appropriate
Yeah,
timescale, back into policy? Because obviously you have forest research sitting off doing things, but you and other foresters are probably, running these experimental stands, and then you've got people who have been managing forests for decades who have a lot of information along these lines of real experience in real conditions. Is
yeah,
Does that get fed back in well enough?
yeah. I mean, it could maybe be better, I guess, because again, we're sort of all a bit time limited and a bit ham-fisted. Yeah, our experiments tend to be very anecdotal and are seldom set up in a scientific fashion, which is of great confounding to our FR colleagues, I suppose. But I've had some dialogue with some FR people about maybe doing some growth monitoring of mixed stands and things, because it's something that we have a huge dearth of information about. Policy seems to be of the view that mixes is good, but what we don't know is what will happen when and how do we forecast what's going to occur, because that is really important for doing our economic planning. Um, so I think anecdotally, I think it's reasonably good through foresters networks, but that's kind of peer-to-peer stuff, I suppose. And you're saying like, how does the practical stuff feed back into policy? Um, yeah, I mean, there's always a low level of dialogue that goes on, but I don't think there's anything resembling a formal practice. So yeah, that could almost certainly be better. But I guess a lot of the decisions and things we've done differently are still really in their infancy. So there wouldn't be, we can observe that things are going well or not so well, but there's no strong um, output yet that you could give to someone else and say, here's how you would go about it too. And these things are so site specific as well that you need replication to some extent. Like I could do something in a bubble somewhere for my specific conditions, and if someone tried it in their own forest, it may be slightly different. It could just not have the same result. So yeah, we are generally quite bad at exchanging information in general, I think, because we all do live in our little bubbles. So yeah,
Yeah, and then I guess I mean, I suppose that's the issue with the kind of science, the controlled experiments, is that there will never be any such thing as a controlled um,
no,
delivery. So even if
yeah,
you had the perfect conditions and somebody else had equally perfect conditions similar to yours, then one season or one localized weather event can totally change it anyway.
yeah, no, for sure. And I was speaking to a friend of mine at FR the other day, and we were kind of musing on the idea that if the things are changing that rapidly, probably it'll be difficult for the scientific community to keep pace with that level of change. If you need a long-term experiment of 30 years or something and lots of money to do it, then it's probably unreasonable to expect that to happen. So maybe the status of the anecdotal foresters experiment will be elevated by that, I suppose, that we're just going to have to experiment in situ. And I think that, the money in the research uh, sector, if that's the right word, is limited, I think. So if we can do more experimenting in situ, then it just creates data of some kind, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah, because I mean, with the best will in the world, you could have your perfect 30-year experiment, but you get to the end of that 30 years, you've got no idea that the next 30 years,
yeah, yeah,
climatically
no,
or,
for sure.
yeah, is going to
That's a
be
good,
the
it's a
same.
good lesson in what's the phrase? Yeah, not letting perfect be the enemy of the good. Like I think there's still a place for like that experimenting in situ.
Yeah, yeah, trying things out, taking a few risks. Because, like
Yeah,
you said, it's a risky business anyway. It's based on hope, really. So,
yeah, no, and I think that is the one thing that, as much as it's easy to be completely defeated by all of the severely scary stuff around climate change, there is something also slightly liberating about it too. That yeah, standing still or taking a leap feel equally perilous. So it doesn't feel like there's so much to lose in some respects because it's danger wherever you look. So I
yeah.
suppose that's as positive a spin as I can put on it.
Yeah, so embracing the uncertainty and letting that, yeah, kind of like liberate ideas.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, no, that's a good point. And so, is there anything, in your experimenting, because there's the thinning and the species, and did I see you were doing sort of like self-thinning mixtures as well?
Yeah,
Is there
yeah.
anything that is working particularly well for you as far as you can tell for now? And are the bits that you're really still figuring out, or bits that make you really curious that you haven't had a chance to try yet?
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of the spruce and aspen mixtures that we've done. I feel like they're excellent, and they were inspired partly from I remember a forest I used to be involved with in the upper Tweed Valley that had, it was like a 70s spruce plantation, but it had a number of broadleaf blocks bolted onto it in the sort of mid 80s or early 90s. And, it was fairly rough upland conditions. So quite hostile. And most of these broadleaf areas were doing pretty poor. Sort of the classic rowan reaching out of a tube and sort of coughing painfully. I didn't really want to be there. But the aspen were growing phenomenally well to the point that they were sort of catching up some of their neighbours, spruce neighbours that were, fairly considerably their senior. And I've also seen areas of sort of spruce regen invading broadleaf areas where the aspen is the one tree that's sort of aloft, this sort of invading Sitka regen. So, and then parallels with Europe and North America where sort of various aspen or poplar species grow together with different spruces, and they seem to have a natural affinity for one another. So putting them together has been, really pleasing, I think, just to see them grow so well together, and just seeing the sort of enhancement of biodiversity you get from the aspen. Like there's such a hunger for their presence from a lot of different invertebrates. Like they suddenly are covered in various colourful moths, larvae, fairly early on. So that sort of attraction of potentially natural enemies to the stand. So, if we have more beasties and grubs to eat, more food for predators, I suppose, then perhaps we bring in higher levels of maybe avian diversity, say, and if we then have issues with aphids or bark beetles, perhaps some of those extra birds that live in these stands are going to be natural enemies of our pest species. So perhaps we get some protective effects from that. So they just look beautiful as well, and they sound beautiful. So that's one aesthetic quality, I suppose. But maybe functionally, I'm more interested in these protective functions, but also the quality litter that they produce and how they condition the soil. I think is something that's really, really important and perhaps slightly overlooked in sort of rotational spruce silviculture. So the Sitka aspen, I'm really, really excited about, and other people seem to respond equally. That when they come and they see it, it speaks to something in them, be it practical or spiritual. I don't know what it is, but it's greatly appealing to people. So definitely the spruce aspen. And what was the last part of your question? Was there something about the future? Is there anything I look forward to?
Just are there still ideas that you things you're still figuring out or things you really want to try? But before you
Yeah,
go there, I do want to just ask you on
please, yeah.
the aspen and the biodiversity that that's bringing. Are you managing to kind of like formally measure that and send it to the record centres and checking the soil to see what difference it's making as opposed to a straight Sitka patch?
Yeah, no, not at the moment. It's purely observational. Um, so no, there's nothing. Yeah, I suppose even just you saying it kind of highlights the fact that it's not going anywhere. Any of that, I suppose. And also, it's probably important to record these things because it's easy for us to get carried away with what we feel, and there's almost certainly an element of confirmation bias in it for me that like I want it to work and be good, thus I believe it will. Whereas
Hmm.
perhaps sometimes the cold hard figures tell you, well, actually it's not that different. So by all means do it, but it's not saving the world, as it were. So
Yeah,
yeah, I think
or
that's
the other way. It could be
yeah,
doing more than you
it
think.
could
Yeah,
be
yeah. So,
exactly. So it's worth knowing that, I think, rather than just living in the dark. So yeah, I think that's maybe given me extra resolve to revisit some of these conversations with people at FR.
mhm. Yeah, it would certainly be interesting to hear about that, even if it's like you say, even if it does need to be anecdotal because it's not within some sort of strict scientific
Yeah.
frame. But that's as real as anything.
Yes.
Um,
And in terms of, is there things that we're still sort of working out? I think with mixtures, there's still huge questions about what is the right ratio, and do we intimately mix things? I is it, one spruce, one aspen, and they're very tight together, or do we sort of chessboard group things where there's clumps of things? And it's again, there's some material out there that can help allude to that. Some of it's not always domestic. A lot of it's European or American literature, but yeah, I'm still not sure what the sweet spot is, and I think it will depend on how you plan to intervene. My view has been so far that if we want beneficial sort of proximity effects, so say there's, I don't know, fungi and bacteria that live in the below ground environment next to an aspen that are beneficial to a spruce, then that proximity effects may be quite important, that they be close together so that the effects can spread. If they don't reach very far laterally, that they are there together. But the danger that comes with that is if you have trees that compete unequally. Spruce is quite a vigorous bit of a bully at times. So if we lose that effective aspen because they're too close and they get out competed, then that could be seen as a negative. So knowing exactly where the dial in the sweet spot is for that is an ongoing process. And I don't think it will be static. Different sites and different scenarios will require different mixes to suit. And I think that's one of the hardest thing around this conversation of, quote, resilience, is we act almost as if resilience is one panacea that will protect everything, but we need to know what it is we're trying to be resilient against in order to design that strategy. And inevitably, sometimes we'll design something that's resilient against bark beetles, but then actually it leaves us more vulnerable to wind or fire. So I'm really not in favour of this term resilience as a blanket thing. I don't think it's very helpful.
Yeah, or the idea that we are, as humans, in charge of
Sure.
knowing what
Yeah.
resilience is and that we can control any of that. What we know for sure is we will need to be flexible and adapt over and
Yeah.
above everything, I think.
Yeah, and I think disturbances, I mean, we still almost act as if we can avoid disturbance, but disturbance is absolutely inevitable and natural. So I think it's just about trying to think, how do we accommodate more disturbance in the way that it isn't so damaging to the systems and outputs we're trying to make.
Yeah, absolutely. So changing tack slightly now, I was interested, because you obviously do have a kind of really open and expansive outlook towards forestry and management and design and thinking. So there's two questions here that kind of are a bit linked. So one is, do you have a kind of like guiding principle or a set of values that you use as your baseline for decision making? And then I was going to also ask, are there any sort of foresters or mentors whose ideas really still shape your thinking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in the first one, values or whatever, I think I've grown pretty fed up of this aesthetic that we sometimes get. I think it slightly comes maybe from some of the policy stuff, like particularly some of the certification stuff. Like it acts almost as if we are in a North American situation where we can do sort of nature conservation in one space and production in another. And I think that's fine if you're in Yosemite or whatever, and you can do thousands of acres of timber production and thousands of acres of nature conservation. But I just don't think on our relatively small island with quite a large population, there's the scope to be so polarized sometimes. I mean, there will be places where that is possible, but so I guess I'm always keen to explore options for having genuine multi-purpose forestry. Not just single coops that are this and then riparian areas that are this, but trying to do both production and biodiversity in a single space. And I think it's been a negative thing for us to try and silo those separately, because I think we need, at least in the context of sort of plantation forestry, we need economics in order to support biodiversity. Like we need money for professional deer control, we need money for gathering of data and collection in order to know what's going on. So that can be hugely beneficial for nature. But likewise, I think production needs biodiversity too, because in my personal view, biodiversity is the mechanism that safeguards our production. It's those biological forces that operate on a level that we can't intervene on. So I think we need both, and I think Scottish forestry and Scottish land management in general has been plagued by siloing, and I think it must stop because it's not helping. So yeah, if we can acknowledge that there's room for both, because for me it's like, as I say, Sitka spruce at the moment is providing a lot of really essential income to do good stuff. So we're harvesting Sitka spruce, which is paying money to our professional deer controller, which is then having cascading impacts in semi-natural habitats like ancient woodland remnants that are now regenerating, or floristic diversity that is increasing. And it's Sitka spruce in that circumstance that's paying the piper to do that. It's not to say that we should cover everything in that, but acknowledge that it is a benefit. In a singular space, Sitka spruce you could argue is a negative force in terms of biodiversity, but when you look at it more holistically, in our particular example, it's really, really benefiting us. And likewise, when we turn our head to the economic lens, I think we really need to think hard about what is the unseen economic impact of these protective functions I've described, or say maintaining soil fertility with different species. So on the spreadsheet, it's not a lucrative hectare of spruce, but what is that birch doing in terms of conditioning soil in order to keep this system in a state that we can grow good spruce for infinite rotations or infinite cycles through time? So yeah, trying to pop that bubble of polarity, I guess, is the values, for want of a better word.
Hmm.
Um,
It's a really interesting way you've described that there, because it can sometimes appear that biodiversity and soil are an add-on after the forestry, whereas you're
yeah,
saying actually it's the fundamental principle, it's the engine room of making sure the forest functions, and we've only got so much input into what's in that biodiversity
yeah,
because there
yeah,
are
for sure. I mean,
systems that we're affecting, but we're certainly not controlling.
yeah,
And so maybe that needs to be a bit of a dialogue shift in the way we look at that.
yeah, and I think it's coming. I mean, I think there's been a lot of chat on soil, maybe more from a disturbance lens of like, diffuse pollution and more like sort of direct impacts of soil damage, I suppose. Whereas maybe it's even the more passive ones that we need to feature into. But I think more like sort of minimal disturbance stuff is coming there through policy and is already in place. But I think maybe the fertility aspect or the maintenance of fertility and conditioning soils, because we're certainly there's more pressure to move away from artificial soil amendments like fertilizer and things. So, not that we use them hugely in my region anyway, because we're fairly fertile, but yeah, maybe we need to revisit natural approaches to fertility maintenance.
Mm.
That, yeah, we cannot grow good quality soil logs without good quality soils. So, even the hard nosed economic operator should really be very concerned about the state of their soil.
Yeah, yeah. And again, do you think that's something where the measurements aren't actually going back from the forests? Because we've got plenty of forest we could be taking
Yeah,
soil samples from and sending them back to the researchers in
yeah,
reality, rather than it coming the other
yeah,
way,
for
them
sure.
designing experiments and sending them to the foresters.
Yeah, it's maybe similar to the thing we talked about earlier with the oceanic forestry. It's like we maybe have data from another time, but maybe there's an opportunity to add more data because the goalposts may have shifted slightly in the interim. So I think there's never a bad, it's never harm in revisiting and revising things. So I certainly have never been involved with data collection of that nature feeding back anywhere. So I don't know if it is going on anywhere else. I dare say it might be, but yeah, it's not happening en masse, put it that way, as
Yeah,
far as I know.
yeah. Sure. And if anyone's listening who knows differently
Yeah,
or has any ideas about this, please do drop us a line at the podcast and let us know because it would be a fascinating discussion to have.
and then
Um,
your final part of that question about sort of inspirational people or mentors, I suppose. Maybe it's a slightly cliched one, but lots of foresters like Mark Anderson, who was around in the 1950s, was a professor at Edinburgh University and I guess considered the father of modern Scottish forestry to some people. And yeah, Anderson wrote this book, The Selection of Tree Species, which yeah, was all about, I guess, creating a sort of site selection type matrix, which predates things like ESC, the ecological site classification, quite considerably, and it's definitely influenced it. But yeah, I suppose Anderson's approach was all about determining an ecological basis for species choice. So working out what your climatic conditions are and your soil conditions through vegetation and soil, and then acting accordingly. And I suppose in the 50s there was less capacity through site modification and fertilizing things to change what nature provided. So you had to be a bit more subtle at recognizing what nature was giving you and choosing species appropriately. So I think that is an aesthetic which has just always appealed greatly to me. Like I think that was one of the things learning at university, classical sort of site recognition. It's sort of like detective work and it's quite pleasing to understand all the nuts and bolts that go into it and then decide on the output after that. So I think, yeah, there's no doubt that we went through a period of um, yeah, looking less at what nature provided and looking more at how we can modify what nature's providing in order to give a homogenous outcome. But there's no doubt that sort of policy is demanding that we go back to an aesthetic where we look at what nature provides and then make a decision on the back of that. So yeah, I mean, maybe it's not a very conspicuous act of heroism, but I consider it a very important thing in the context of our industry, I suppose.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I guess so. Following on from that, I was going to ask you if you had, absolute freedom, you were the king of
Mm.
the forest for the day. What would you do? And I guess it would be good to sort of if you want to, in answering that question, I guess you could specify what your favorite site would be, to
Sure.
have in the first place,
Yeah,
and then what you would do.
yeah. Well, favourites that would be easy. It'd be like super adequately fertile, well drained soil with loads of shelter and very little herbivore impact. So it'd be like the unobtainably wonderful site. I think I would just want mixes everywhere. I think just like really diverse mixtures of species growing in different patterns, I suppose. And maybe one thing worth saying is like I feel we've been really poor at growing native broadleafs for timber. So I guess I would want lots of good examples of native broadleafs. So native woodland that is functioning for biodiversity, but is also producing really high quality timber. So that would be a good one. And yeah, just I've always found mixtures very pleasing. Mixed forest, just there's something about it aesthetically, but also I think in the way that it's functioning. So I feel like some of these early Forestry Commission plantings, yeah, from maybe the 40s and 50s, they, I guess, planted on, quote, Anderson principles. There's often a really high level of diversity in them, or, the moment that site conditions change, so does the species that are on them. So, yeah, I don't know what level that are sort of, that we're recognizing that, but there's something in it that's beyond just the aesthetic. I think like we can somehow recognize that intimacy of site conditions changing. So yeah, it would just be a very, very wildly diverse forest, I suppose. But I would hope that we would also be producing, through the act of that, producing really high quality products that are, ending up in good long life applications, and we're selling them for good value, and that value's been pumped back into more of the same. So yeah, it's a complete panacea, this forest. Clearly, it's like it's doing everything at all times. But I think we can. I think there is scope to move more towards not pleasing everyone at the same time would be the wrong thing, but just meeting multiple objectives. Like I think it's much more possible than we've had room for. But I would say that I mentioned the site type would have to be this beautiful, ideal, well-drained, sheltered thing. So I think there is still a reality that sometimes isn't captured in policy documents, that sometimes they act as if we could deploy maximal diversity everywhere. And clearly, there is still like a geological, climatic reality at hand that doesn't means we can't do maximal diversity everywhere. But I think there's places that we can do better than we are doing currently, I suppose. So maybe that's a easy wish list, is just to say where we can do more diversity, then I'm definitely in favour of that.
Yeah, fantastic. Have you got any thoughts on that, about in between economic outputs for the forest? Between you've got maybe thinning, obviously, and you've got harvesting, but could we be doing more on other economic benefits? And that might not always be tangible product like fiber, it might be
Yeah.
other activity in the
No,
forest.
I think for sure. I mean, I have a friend, Marco Cenconi, who's big into mushrooms. He runs a mushroom co-op in Edinburgh, mushroom growing co-op, but he's done a lot of research recently with help from Future Wood Scotland, the like chaga cultivation, so this medicinal conch mushroom. And yeah, from the work that he's done, it would be surprisingly easy to there's still unanswered questions about sort of ecological impact, even though you've been using native strains. Like there's work to be done to understand, would there be an ecological risk or even a pathogen risk, because it is a very weak pathogen of trees. But in theory, it might be possible to inoculate what would be, quote, uneconomic trees with a very economic non-timber forest product. So I think these things are more often explored at very small scale, small holders or woodlots and things. But I think there's scope for larger scale forests to get more involved with that different modes of production. I mean, I always laugh because I had a friend who was at the Woodland Trust who would always tease me saying, you commercial foresters, you don't know how to market anything. All you sell is lumps of woods, whereas we sell, you can adopt a log and you can sponsor a pine cone for a week and have a red squirrel pen pal or whatever. So like we don't actually, for all that we are, quote, commercial foresters, we sell very little of the forest, which is slightly bizarre. So yeah, I think sometimes these things, imagination and time particularly is the limiting factor. Lots of people are whizzing about doing the best that they can in quite a short period of time. So these more intricate things tend to fall by the wayside. But I think some of it is perception rather than actual, because the chaga stuff is actually quite relatively low impact or low time input, I should say, in terms of you drill a few inoculated dowels into a few trees and come back several years later and harvest them. So it's not like, tending micro herbs with a set of nail scissors or something. It's pretty low input. So I think every time I come across these things, there's scope for it. I know sometimes people would take this view that, well, if it's not happening already, that's because someone's already tried it and it's not worked. But yeah, I think maybe maybe forestry and land use management in general would be bad for trying something once and then sort of maybe we didn't get it quite right, but then we vowed never again, it'll never work ever again. And that's not our great inclination to be in, I don't think. So try and stay fairly open-minded to
Yeah, for sure.
these
I mean,
good
I
run
remember.
things.
Sorry, yeah. I remember inoculating birch logs probably 25 years ago and the mushrooms not coming and the sort of had that exactly the same thing. But, so we all know from growing anything, one time failure is no indication of whether it will work again.
Yeah,
And there's an absolute explosion in those mushroom markets. I mean, my cupboard's got
sure.
a jar of Jagger in there for sure.
Yeah,
And I'm sure
yeah,
that's across the board. And I've heard I was listening, was it Paul Stammet? I don't
yeah.
probably pronouncing
Stamets,
his
yeah.
name wrong. Yeah, talking about, turkey tail and the huge sort of impact that could have for kind of immunity, I think
Yeah,
he was talking about with respect to COVID in particular. So there's the medicinal benefits of this, which also
yeah,
um for me, when you mentioned the time element of all this, it seemed to me the perfect opportunity to bring that community wealth building, local economic development thing,
hmm
that you could have more local enterprises working with the trees in the forest, as assuming it's a non-damaging way,
yeah, yeah,
that would drive that the thing that everybody's looking for at the moment. How do we make this work? And everyone's trying to figure it out. And these micro enterprises that could actually be very economically successful could be
yeah.
a really good way of looking at that.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I would agree. I mean, I think again, it's like there's a sort of polarity thing that goes on there too, that it's like in the commercial forest, that's for workers and operators. And then if you want to do community stuff, that's for community woodlands. And it's like there's not
yeah,
much in between. So there's no doubt that we could, to mutual benefit, yeah, do more together, I think. Don't know
yeah.
exactly how yet, but there's definitely untold potential there.
Yeah, it sounds like an experiment waiting to happen because there's
Mm,
also the non-tangible, the non-product based activity in the forest that also
yeah,
would provide one of those opportunities as
yeah.
well.
And whenever I see, I think FR have done the odd analysis over time of you sort of the benefit of non-timber stuff, things like clean air or mental well-being and stuff.
Mm,
And whenever they start to attribute values to these things, there's 10 more zeros than there ever is for selling wood.
hmm
I appreciate that none of it's actually tangibly worth anything till somebody puts a pound note in your hand. But yeah, the value to society of these um, less tangible things is often ginormous, at least on paper. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, hopefully we'll see, a bit more of that kind of thing going forward
mhm.
anyway. Um, I was wondering, is there something in the whole kind of spectrum of forestry discussion that you think gets discussed least or forgotten about altogether, which we really should be talking about? It's possible that you've already kind of covered this already.
Yeah, I think probably, yeah, we probably have. I think this, yeah, these sort of natural protective functions, I think we need to get maybe more on board in these, particularly, understanding what does what. Because as I say, I've sort of have some notions that are partly guesswork, partly real stuff taken from other examples from different countries, literature or whatever, but trying to actually work out what combinations of what going together does what effect and how does that influence resilience. So I think that outcome-based stuff is going to be really important to understand more of rather than just planting 25 different species and hoping that that equals diversity or rather equals resilience, because I don't think it'll work that way. And then, yeah, I think the other is soil fertility and things, because we use yield generally as I guess, a canary in the mine shaft that things are okay. So if we grow the same species repeatedly and the yield doesn't drop, then that's everything as well. But I think yield is quite a narrow parameter with which to be a proxy for health, I suppose. There's a lot going on in soil that just because it's still growing relatively high yield, is it functioning right, and is it functioning in a way that if we suddenly change the system, can it function equally across the options that we might have? So, I mean, that's a difficult thing, I guess, to examine on I can dig a soil pit and look at what the soil type is, but it's not easy for me with minimal technology and time to analyze what is the life in the soil. Um, so yeah, I think I have concerns about growing the same crop in the same piece of ground in perpetuity, just because like civilizations have ended off the back of doing that. So it seems a pretty like there's lots of cautionary tales of why that might not be a great idea. And I feel that, yeah, again, UKFS and things have kind of, not necessarily purposefully, but most plantations now are moving to this model of broadleaf buffers in sensitive places, particularly riparian areas, and then the rest of the forest repeats as a unit of spruce in perpetuity, just rotating and rotating. But I just don't see that there's a huge parallel for that in nature. Like generally, stand disturbance is followed by a sort of ecological succession that will have impacts on the soil positively in terms of rebuilding leaf litter and things. So yeah, I feel we're possibly missing a pretty essential step of succession that concerns me, I guess. And I would maybe like to know more what the impacts of that will be. And it might be that over a couple of rotations it doesn't make a huge amount of difference, or the extra CO2 in the atmosphere means that we don't see a drop. But something must be going on, because just there's no other industry that grows plants that would grow the same crop in the same ground repeatedly, not in horticulture, not in agriculture. So what is it that makes us think we can do that and get away with it unscathed? Just a lingering concern, I suppose.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, food for thought. And I think succession in general across the whole discussion around land use and conservation isn't something that actually gets a lot of airtime. So,
Mm.
yeah, thanks for bringing that up. We're coming close to the end now, but we've stolen a tradition from Stephen Bartlett where the person we interview last leaves a question for the next person without knowing who they are.
Okay.
So we had Claire Whiteman along last time, and her question is, how can we improve openness, sharing, and collaboration in the forestry sector?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I guess of late there's been a few flashpoints, hasn't there, where everything gets very aggro and probably become more partisan rather than more open to discussion. So yeah, I think leaving the internet alone would help, like having conversations in person with a human set of eyes looking back at you rather than a keyboard with which to be thrashed. So yeah, I think, well, I think crossing disciplines as well. I think any events I've been to that are not, just for foresters or just for ecologists or whatever, they definitely do a lot to break down barriers between people. So yeah, speaking to other human beings in the flesh in a context that is not so predefined, I suppose. So things like you came along to that CEDA event a while back that we did at Croft Head, which was kind of about architecture and things, but like crossed all these different boundaries, and to have architects and growers and sawmillers and artists and architects, like having all those people represented, it changes the conversation quite significantly compared to like a table of foresters on one side and a table of ecologists thrashing out on one side. Like I kind of inclined to believe we all have a lot more in common than we do in different most of the time. So ways that allow us to find those commonalities, I think, and see where we go with them. Because the negatives, it's so easy to do the negative, but I don't think it's really helping any of us particularly. Not to say that people shouldn't call out things they disagree with or find unpalatable, but the endless cycle of negative commentary, I don't think it's helping. So yeah, to answer the question, more face-to-face stuff in open-minded, fluid scenarios, I suppose. Again, that's going to be hard for somebody to make an Eventbrite for, but you get what I'm saying. So,
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a really good point. So more gathering in person and more interdisciplinary gathering,
I
and
think so. I do,
gathering
yeah.
away from flashpoints and points of tension so that when
Yeah.
those points do arise, people have that human relationship with each other.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think, I've definitely been in scenarios, I mean, just as you've described, where like you already have a human relationship with someone, and it just, if you can, because I think the worst parts of human nature happen when we do dehumanize each other, and the internet makes that really easy to do when it's just a name or a picture. So I think if it stops people going into that sort of first response mode, it makes much more useful, productive dialogue, I think. So yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, that's a great kind of positive note to end on as well.
Yeah, good. Good.
Yeah, a huge thank you for joining us. That's been absolutely fascinating.
Not at all, pleasure.
Yeah, and if anyone's listening and you've got any thoughts or ideas or feedback on anything we've talked about, or ideas or people you'd like us to talk to in the future, please do drop us a line. And remember, if you subscribe to whichever platform you're watching or listening to this on, then you'll get notifications of when we put a new episode forward. Okay, so thank you very much to everyone who's joined us listening, and another thank you to Andrew for coming along. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. If something sparked a thought, a memory, or a bit of healthy friction, that's what we're here for. If you'd like to be part of a future conversation, please drop us a line. You can sign up to Forest Policy Group or support the work we do with a donation. It all helps to keep things moving forward. Until next time, take care.